Good day, everybody. Welcome to the monthly Conexxus webinar series, and we're happy to have you on this November day. Today, we're going to talk about 3 real-world scenarios that impact PCI compliance. And I know with PCI compliance on the top of everybody's brain and in the forefront of their day, we wanted to bring this to you, compliments of Rob Chapman, who is the Director of Information Security at Cyberra. Next slide. Next slide. I don't think the slides are advancing.
Rob, are you able to hear? I think the slides aren't advancing.
All right. Yep, I think we lost him on audio, so I am going to bring it up. Just a moment, folks. Sorry for the delay here. So we do need to get Rob back on. So Karen, I don't know if you can send a note to Rob and let him know that we can't hear him.
Yeah, I just did. So stand by. Sorry, everybody.
That's all right. And so I'm going to go through a couple of housekeeping items while Ron tries to establish here. All right. So our agenda today, I'll go through a couple of housekeeping items and talk a little bit about Rob and I'll talk a little bit more also about Conexxus. We'll go through the presentation and then follow it up with Q&A. So I did want to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available in a few days. You can find it at YouTube under the Conexxus online subscription. You can also go to the conexxus.org website, and under resources, there's a webinars section, and you can have it replayed. And also, several of our webinars can also be replayed as there. You can obtain a copy of the slide deck if you complete a survey. So about an hour after the webinar has concluded, you'll receive an email that has a link to the survey. The survey is very short, and what we do is just like to have just some quick feedback and also your thoughts on future webinars. And if you complete the survey, then you will be then emailed a link to obtain a copy of the slide deck. We do ask that questions are typed in using the GoToWebinar panel. There's a little section called questions. And if you open up that section, and you can type in your questions there. And we do say, please note vendor-specific questions. And if you need to use our webinars towards PCI continuing ed credits, please contact Allie Russell, which is arussell@conexxus.org, for questions regarding a certificate of webinar for attendance. And if you do have any questions, please email us at info@conexxus.org. Our host today is Allie Russell. So thank you, Allie, for all your coordination and letting people know of our webinars so they can attend today. My name is Kara Gunderson. I am the chair of the Data Security Committee, and my day job, I actually manage payments at Citgo Petroleum. And Rob Chapman is, as I mentioned earlier, is the Director of Information Security at Cyberra. So Rob, can you hear us yet? Or can we hear you?
Can you hear me now?
We can. That's great.
All right.
So Rob,
thank you.
Tell
Sorry
us
about
a
that.
little bit about yourself. No problem. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure.
And what you do at Cyberra.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the Director of Information Security for Cyberra. I cover all security, both internal corporate as well as customer facing. Before that, I worked at Mapco, and on the operator side, I owned all network security and infrastructure. And before that, I was at Delic and worked in the security on the ERP and GRC side. And so that's been the last several roles that I've had. So I've been in the petrol C-store space for several years now, responsible for both security and compliance.
That's great. So Conexxus is an independent, nonprofit, member-driven organization. And it is really, really run by by volunteers such as myself. We've got Rob, that's a volunteer. Karen, also, who is assisting us with Cyberra, is another volunteer. And so it's really the volunteers that will set the standards for data exchange, security, mobile commerce, and that allows Conexxus to provide vision and identify emerging technologies and trends. You'll also find Conexxus heavily involved within the payments industry and including other industry events and organizations. We've had a great webinar schedule in 2020, as you can see. And again, as I mentioned, if you go to conexxus.org or under YouTube under Conexxus Online, you can replay any one of these. And we've got some great ones coming up. So after today, we've got December 3rd, we've got another EMV webinar, which is a focus on third-party retrofit kits. So sure to provide some great information there and some great alternatives. In January, Simon from Maker will be talking about securely connecting third-party vendors. As we know, so many data breaches come from third parties connecting to the point-of-sale systems or the cardholder data environment. And then in February, Ash and Robert from Omega will be talking about their step-by-step approach to automating security response in a multi-vendor environment. So I think you'll find that those dovetail nicely together. We'd like to thank our 2020 Diamond sponsors, of which Cyberra here, our presenter, is one of them. And so without Cyberra and the rest of those, Conexxus would not be able to put on this great programming. They have an awesome annual conference. And so they really do rely, since it is a nonprofit volunteer organization, they do rely on both the talent and the financial benefits of the companies that are involved. So now, Rob, I'm going to turn this over to you and make you the presenter again and let you give us your great presentation on 3 real-world scenarios for compliance.
All right, sounds great. Thank you so much. I'm going to skip ahead to where we were, and hopefully audio will keep working and we'll rock along here. So as I was mentioning, I think it's important to start any kind of conversation with a little bit of a level set. And so I've already introduced who I am, and one of the first things I kind of want to say is, I'm going to be sharing several opinions here. These come from my experiences, but I also acknowledge there's no monopoly on this kind of thing. And one of the things I want to show a great appreciation for is the Conexxus group and similar groups working in this space. There's a lot of important people and a lot of important voices that are contributing to this. And even as we've prepared for this webinar, I've received lots of feedback from folks saying, hey, this is how we're working on some of these issues you're going to be talking about. And so I'm very optimistic and excited about the future as it relates to some of the things we're going to be talking about today. As far as expectations and concerns for this talk, one of the big things that I'm hoping that you take away from this is just an understanding that we have an opportunity to do really good security in this vertical, and that it doesn't require significant R&D, new technology, or even significant radical changes. In a lot of ways, it just simply means doing what's right, and really using the leadership that we have to operationalize really good security. One of the things that I greatly appreciate about a former mentor of mine and someone that I reported to, a gentleman named Kevin Brunger at Mapco, is that anytime we would encounter a new project or any kind of solutioning issue relative to a problem, when we come with all the various options, you're thinking about cost and you're thinking about, what are the various obstacles you're trying to overcome. And one of the things he always asked was, what's the right thing to do? And I think that's an incredibly useful question. And it's the kind of question I'm going to be really focusing a lot of my talk on today. And then the last thing that I want to talk about before we jump into the content is a couple of mental models. I don't know the full landscape of who all's listening today to this talk. I don't know your backgrounds in security. And so it's helpful for me to kind of level set. And so the first thing I want to share is a mental model around trust and untrust. We use this concept all over computing. It's a part of how we build operating systems, software. It's how we design networks. And everything starts with this understanding of what is trusted and what is untrusted. And so, for example, like many of you today on this webinar, if you're like me, if you've worked from home during the pandemic, you've probably joined hundreds or maybe even thousands of online types of meetings like this. And if you're like me, the way that you normally do that is you have your computer, you have your calendar application or some other means of keeping track of these. You click on a link embedded in the application. This starts a browser or maybe a third-party app that's installed on your computer. It reaches out and connects to the wider internet and servers that are serving that content and connecting you to the other people on it. It's prompting you for your camera, your microphone, and all the various things. And we generally at a high level trust all of that. I'm not going to get into the details of encryption, but at a high level, we didn't have to reconfigure our home network. We didn't have to reconfigure our corporate environment for that. We simply trust that interaction. But if we take that same experience and we turn it around and we say, let the server initiate the conversation, and let the server reach into your network, and let the server start the application on your computer, and let those servers and outside parties prompt your microphone and computer to come on with no interaction from you, we would probably hate that experience. We would not trust that at all. It would be a complete violation. And most of our systems are designed to prevent that kind of initiated contact. And so this seems intuitive, and I think a lot of people look at this and go, yeah, we get this. We do this all the time. But I would argue that most of the biggest security issues that we have in our space from a design perspective come from when we flip this and when we allow untrusted systems to largely talk to trusted systems without being thoughtful about it. And so the next thing I want to talk about is the concept of blast radius. This is something that I think we've spoken a lot more about over the last several years. This is something that I think we need to be talking about more. And it's probably something that we spend most of our time thinking about in security. Over a long enough timeline, you're going to have a security impacting event if you're operating in any kind of environment where you have some kind of attack surface. And given that, one of the things that you're always trying to understand is if someone attacks me and is able to get credentials from a phishing attack, if an endpoint is subject to malware, ransomware, what's the propagated effect of that incident? Does it immediately spread across the entire network? Does it immediately give someone the keys to the kingdom in terms of root credentials or domain admin or whatever your systems may be? And we have to be very thoughtful about what that impact is. And blast radius is not so much a technology as it is a design thinking. And so today we're going to be talking about those two mental models. What's the blast radius of an event? And what is the trusted and untrusted component that we're considering? In almost any case where someone brings to me a case of security issue that needs to be answered, these are the kinds of fundamental first principles I'm thinking about as I consider those issues. So today we're going to talk about kind of three scenarios. The first one is what I consider one of the most valuable parts of the data security standard, which is penetration testing and the value that it brings. I'm going to talk about the impact of IoT, especially in security around the car data environment and how that affects PCI scoping. And then the last thing is we're going to talk about security around the edge. We could talk about all sorts of telemetry systems like SCADA and otherwise, but I'm going to focus on ATG systems today. So one of the things that came out back in about 2016 was this guiding scoping document to help people in PCI environments understand how they should be thinking about their systems. And I think this is really a great intro to this document that sets the stage for our conversation today. So in brief, it simply says, because the system is not in scope for the PCI DSS, it doesn't mean the entity should leave the system unprotected, as it can still pose a risk to the entity's network and business. A common pattern seen in data breaches is where the attacker targets systems deemed by the entity to be out of scope for PCI and then leverages those systems to gain access to more systems, which eventually provides a path to systems where cardholder data can be found. And this is true not just in terms of the data security standard and cardholder data. This is really the underlying model of all security systems. If you attack a lower priority system and use that as a foothold into the environment, that's exactly what we're talking about when we think about things like blast radius. And so I want to start with that because I think it's a really good way to think about how we think about data security within this environment. So I want to take a step back and tell you a little bit about an experience I had several months ago. I have a colleague and friend who is the owner-operator of quite a few C-stores. They have both a branded and unbranded experience, and they're big enough where they have to do a full report on compliance. So they're doing that third-party QSA type of experience with PCI. And so they had to do a third-party penetration test. And, you know, he's not a technical person. He's an operator, owner-operator. And he came to me and he said, listen, I've gotten some quotes for penetration testing, and they're very expensive. And I just don't know anything about this. Do you have any recommendations, any advice on what to do? And I said, absolutely. I said, I can't speak to the vendors that you've gotten, but I can at least speak to the process and maybe make a recommendation for another vendor. And so I recommended a vendor I really like that I've worked with over the years that have done a really good job. And, you know, I explained to him, you know, the goal is not so much just to pass, even though that would be great without any findings. The goal is to learn, because here's the thing I'll tell you, the folks that I'm recommending, they're not the cheapest people in town, but I think they're great value. But more importantly, they're going to thoroughly hack you and own you if they can. And he kind of laughed and he said, okay, that's great. You know, let me know the contact information. I'll let you know how it goes. So I passed it along. He reached out. They ended up liking each other enough to do a statement of work. And then I kind of sat on it. And a few weeks later, I ran into one of the field workers that works for this gentleman. And I asked him, I said, hey, did you ever hear about the results of the penetration test? And he started laughing. And I said, what is so funny? And he said, you would not believe it, but they completely and thoroughly owned our environment. I mean, just thoroughly hacked us. And I said, really? I said, how's that, how are y'all dealing with that? And he said, our IT manager is just fit to be tied. He's so frustrated right now. And he said, he had made all these overtures to the leadership about how secure we were and all the controls that they had in place. And now he's running around trying to figure out how these guys got in and how to put it all back together. I'm very sympathetic to that IT manager's experience. I've been there. I've been responsible for security systems and done penetration testing as a part of my security program and been thoroughly owned. Full domain admin access, full root access, access to everything. And it never happens the way that I thought it would. And at first, it's one of those things where if you're not careful, you're tempted to just have your ego hurt. And you're tempted to feel like a failure, and you're tempted to have all these imposter, syndrome kind of feelings around this. But in a lot of cases, I think that's kind of missing the broader point of what we're trying to do, which is to really understand what are the outcomes that we're looking for. And over the years, one of the things that I've developed is a really deep appreciation for penetration testing, because it's one of the few tools that I think, given how capable a team that you're working with is, can really help you to understand what's happening in your environment. You should be looking for every opportunity to learn from it. Do we want findings? No, we don't, because generally, that means we've got problems. But I would rather have findings in a controlled setting than from a real threat actor. And so for that reason alone, I think they're wonderful, because oftentimes these are evidence pieces that come out of this that help me to drive my security program for the rest of the year, to increase our budgets where we're needing them, and to really tell the story of what the case is for security in whatever environment I'm protecting. Now, one of the things that I think we've struggled with in not just our vertical here in the petroleum space and the retail C-store space, but really across the board, is around the values and differences between penetration testing and vulnerability scanning. I was at DEF CON, which is a kind of a hacker conference a couple of years ago, and one of the guys that got up to do a presentation, he's a penetration tester, and he got up and he was saying, I have to admit and confess to the fact that I've been part of a scam. And I don't mean to be, and I certainly wouldn't want to be if I were running the show, but he said, I've worked at shops where we have sold vulnerability scans as penetration tests, and they're not the same thing. And there were a lot of people who were agreeing and kind of amening, what he was saying. And I've seen the same thing in our space, because people are concerned about the cost of these experiences, and especially if they're non-technical, they seem to, think that these things are largely the same. And I kind of want to start, by taking a step back and explaining the differences and really just calling attention to it in case you're seeing this in the same ways that I have. Vulnerability scanning is super important. It's a part of the data security standard that we have, and it's something that should be a part of any program, but it's really kind of just the start of a good penetration testing engagement. A vulnerability scan and experience is largely there to lay the foundation for what are the potential issues that you may have in your network that could be exposed and leveraged by a threat actor to do something malicious. A penetration test takes that same information and goes a step further and actually tries to do that. If you get a report at the end of a penetration testing engagement and all it is an Excel spreadsheet of hosts and potential vulnerabilities, then you've not gotten a real penetration test more than likely. A penetration test is going to have this really beautiful narrative usually that says, yes, we did a vulnerability scan. Yes, we did reconnaissance. Here's some open source intelligence, that we've gathered from LinkedIn and Google and Bing and all those things. And what we've done is we've put all those things together and then attacked you. And here's the evidence that we did that. We used this tool or we used this capability. Here's the screenshots. Here's where we were able to get inside or maybe where we failed. Here's where we pivoted, here's where we privilege escalated, and so forth and so on, so that at the end you have this incredible narrative that shows all the little steps that someone was able to use to get to compromise of their intended goal or target. And so, if you're going through this engagement and you've not had that experience, I really encourage you to look for better partners in this space. The next thing you want to really be thoughtful about is, are you modeling the real world experiences that face both you as a daily operator and the kinds of things that are happening around you? One of the things that I think I've seen and experienced is the subtle differences between when you're engaging a partner and they are asking you to set up maybe an account to test with, is that you sometimes don't always model those experiences how you really would. For example, many penetration tests, given the short amount of time in which they are operating, no more than 2 to 3 weeks, try to simulate what might happen over the course of several months. And so to do that, they compress the timeline a little bit by saying, we're going to assume that we have a foothold in your environment. And so you need to give us a somewhat privileged account within your environment, and we're going to use that to see how far laterally we can move. And if you're not careful, you're going to give them an AD account, LDAP, Okta, whatever it is that you use. And if it's not really thought about, you're not going to give them the right thing. And I've seen this. I've had penetration testing engagements where we gave them just a pure AD account. It worked. They could log in, but that was it. And it didn't actually simulate what we gave real employees. And because of that, we had passing marks. Whereas in other instances where we've given them what we normally give employees, access to the ticketing system, access to the Slack chat space, access to the wiki, and all of the other details that come along with that, all of a sudden they have a treasure trove of information and access and ways of talking to people that allow much better access in the environment for testing. And it's honestly real world. It's the kind of thing we would give a real employee. And the reason that's so important, and one of the arguments that I would make about any good penetration test, is that I would question anyone that ever passes a penetration test with no findings whatsoever. And the reason I'm skeptical is not because you can't have really good technical controls in place, but because of the people side of it. One of the things that has to be a part of your testing really needs to be an engineering, social engineering and phishing attack. And any good phishing attack and social engineering project as a part of a pen testing engagement will almost always capture people, especially really sophisticated ones. I know the team that we work with, I spoke to them about this and I said, of all the techniques that you use with social engineering, what's your effectiveness rate? How often do you capture credentials and those, types of things that you're after? And they said, oh, absolutely 100% of the time. Of the audience that we target for a social engineering engagement, 70% will open up the emails that we send them, and of that, nearly half will give us some credentials. And so, that's the reason that I say over a long enough timeline, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And so based on that, we have to be making assumptions around somebody will get popped. It's just the question of what happens afterwards. It's the blast radius conversation. Lastly, before we move on from this content, one of the things that I think is critically important is that we're engaging with modern threats and attacks. One of the things that I think is important is that we're thinking about how attackers are evolving what they're doing. And so if you're engaging with a third party and they're not doing continuing education to use better and newer tools in what they're doing, then your defenses and your strategies can't keep up to date either. And so I hope that everyone, as they're engaging this, are doing so very actively. It's not just this passive thing where you get a statement of work, you sign the paperwork to pay them and then call it a day, but rather you're asking and engaging through the process, what type of tools are you using? How is this manifesting what you see in the real world with what we're doing here? Because again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to build in a feedback loop that validates what we think we know. And that feedback loop, where it's through this kind of third-party penetration testing or any other thing that we do in this space, is one of the most important things that we do. And so as we kind of finish that up, I want to move to the next topic, because it's another issue around validating what we think we know. And it's the question that comes up around scoping. And this is another quote that comes from that same document earlier from the PCI Council. And it says, when it comes to scoping for the PCI DSS, the best practice approach is to start with the assumption that everything is in scope until verified otherwise. And I think this is probably the single most important piece of information just about that comes out of that document. Because quite frankly, I think the experiences I've had with integrators of technology, manufacturers, OEMs, operators, is we assume the exact opposite. And I want to tell you kind of a brief story of my experience with that. So a couple of years ago, I was working with a project where we had a huge technology lift in the C-store space. We were replacing pretty much everything. New point of sale that was a commercial off-the-shelf solution, new cloud services with different software vendors, a new back office, new credit card processor. Literally everything was new. We ripped the entire store out and put in all new technology and services. And one of the things we had to do was an integration between the point of sale that had some third-party data that we were sending off to this software hosted in a cloud somewhere. And we had built an integration before that worked, and now we couldn't use that because we couldn't add code to this commercial off-the-shelf solution. So we went to the vendor that did this third-party stuff for us, and we said, how do we connect your platform to our new point of sale? And they said, well, we have this really nice, protocol converter box that we can give you. And it's just, small little box. You plug it into your network, point your point of sale at it, and it'll automatically do all the protocol conversion and do what it needs to do with our cloud. Now, this company that we were working with, they were PCI certified. They had an AOC. We had a responsibility matrix. We had kind of gone through all the steps. I was a little nervous about it because here we are introducing a new computing device in the environment, but they had largely described it, and I don't want to speak for them. This is just my experience, so that's what I'm reflecting on. But the way I'd heard it was, this is not a general purpose computer. It's just a little kind of Linuxy box that, it's pre-programmed, hardened. Again, it's an appliance. I couldn't log into it. I don't have credentials. It's just kind of a VCR, so to speak. And so I knew we were going to have some interesting conversations when it came to our report on compliance time with our QSA, but I thought, I think we can get through this. I'm not too worried about it. These boxes are used all over the place, I imagine. We're not the first ones to deal with this. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. And so like any new technology, we were rolling it out, and we ran into some little hiccups, and we kind of came across something that we thought was a bug. And we were having to reboot these devices a lot. And so we reached out to our partner and we said, listen, these boxes that you gave us, we think there's a bug. What do we need to do? And they said, well, the first thing we need to do is figure out what's going on. So we need to get logs off of it. We're like, great, how do you do that? And they're like, well, we'll call the third-party managed service to pull logs off of it. And I immediately paused and said, what do you mean, third-party managed service? They're like, oh, well, these boxes aren't ours. We get them from this third party. and they'll have to get it. And so, my heart sinks a little bit, because now we've got yet another group that I have no contract with that is managing a device that's in my, scope for my card data environment. And I said, okay, how do we do this? Do they do a screen share with us and log in some way? And they're like, oh, no. The box automatically establishes a connection with them, and they can jump down through that connection in a reverse shell and pull it remotely. And that's when I knew we're in some serious trouble. I said, guys, that's a fully managed service. We've got some serious PCI questions here. And they're like, what do you mean? And I was like, this is the way you've described this, and the way we've set this up is this talks directly to our point of sale. And if they have direct access that they can jump into anytime, there's lots of issues around that. And I said, we're going to have to talk to them. And so we called them up and we said, hey, we think you've got some PCI impacting things going on here. We need you to help us here. Do you have an AOC? Do you have all the little PCI things that we need to do? And they didn't. They're like, we're not in scope. We don't have anything to do with PCI. We don't send or, manage cardholder data. What does this have to do with anything? And that's when I knew, we might be potentially in some big problems here. So I want to take a step back for those who maybe don't work with PCI stuff and security stuff a whole lot, and explain a little bit about why this is kind of a big heartburn for me. Generally speaking, when we are thinking about what matters for PCI, what is quote unquote in scope for PCI, there's really three things that make up a scope that's important. The first one is the thing that everyone naturally thinks of. It's the thing that we kind of gravitate towards, which is what are all the systems that are part of the standard card data flow? What is emitting, transmitting, storing, manipulating, otherwise handling cardholder data? So our point of interaction, all of our networking gear, point of sale, payment gateway, all those details. But there's more to it than that. There's these two other things that are rather insidious that end up causing us all sorts of heartburn. It's what we think of as connected technologies and security impacting technologies. And again, we have this statement from that original document that I shared earlier that said systems with connectivity or access to or from the CDE are considered connected to systems. And these systems have communication path to one or more system components in the CDE. So therefore, connectivity may occur over physical, wireless, and virtualized technologies, and they give examples of that. And so we have this graphic from that same document that lays out what are all the things that are potentially in scope. And when we say in scope, what we mean is all the rules apply to those systems from the data security standard. And so we see all of the shared systems, all of those connected systems over on the left. We see all of the actual card data systems over on the right. And then we have what we call security impacting systems. These are generally things like admin workstations. And so I'm explaining this to that vendor and saying, guys, the way we've designed this, this box can talk to and from freely the point of sale system. And so, that's what's giving us heartburn here. And so, they kind of just unfortunately raised their hands. We're like, we don't know what to tell you. We'll do the best we can to, provide you some details on how we manage the box and do what we do. But, that's kind of your problem is the way it came across to us. And so, we really kind of felt like we were stuck. And so we spent a lot of time, and long story short, and that's, one of the things that we did is we just simply took a lot of packet captures of the network and looked at what's the directionality of flow of data. And if you go back to that original mental model where we talked about that trust and untrust, the direction of the data flow is what matters in that experience. And so here in this graphic that I've created, if I've got a system here that talks back and forth freely with our point of sale system, it's automatically in scope, regardless of anything going on there. But you can have situations where, the systems that are in scope, like the CDE systems, can talk out to a system, and that system can respond back. And as long as there's no, security impacting messaging going on there, you can keep that connected system out of scope. And this is obviously a conversation you have with your QSA. And so one of the things that we fortunately found was that the POS was initiating all of the conversations with this protocol converter box. What we had been told was not necessarily the case. It doesn't need this bi-directional capability to start a conversation. So, we were able to put in firewall rules that said, this box can't talk to the point of sale, but the point of sale can talk to the box and get responses back. And so we were able to demonstrate that and get it out of scope. And so, all's well as ended well there, but one of the things that was really problematic is that it wasn't really anything that we couldn't have dealt with if we hadn't had better communication and documentation. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I see, both being in the managed services space and then also as someone that was on the operator space. You have oftentimes in a lot of these places so many different parties working together that we tend to just optimize for, is it working or not? And then we move on. And we've never asked that original question of, are we doing the right thing? And so, one of the first things that I think we can do is just really change our expectation around what do we provide end users when it comes to this kind of information. The second thing is, I think the defense of, if I'm going to play in this space, that I could just opt out of PCI responsibilities because I don't think I manage cardholder data, we have to get rid of that mentality. As I was, referencing that document earlier where it said, you should basically assume you're in scope until otherwise told that you're not. If you're someone that makes technology, provides a service, or does anything that interacts in the C-store space around payment or the point of sale system, you just might as well hop on board and assume that you're in scope. You could design to be out of scope and try and prove that case, but you're just causing heartache if you don't assume and take the due diligence to really be thoughtful about it. The last thing that I can say, and this is an opportunity for me to jump on a little bit of a soapbox here, is I think that we deserve better design. We deserve better design in a lot of ways, both with the things that we can immediately do and then the things that we should be doing as people that build these systems. One of the things that I think is going to continue to plague us until we change our understanding of how we build these systems is, again, that violation of trust and untrust. One area in particular, and I don't talk about it today as a part of my major themes, but I want to mention it here. I think the biggest mistake that we make in IoT systems, connected systems, and generally untrusted systems is around the back office computer. To me, any scoping or car data environment that includes a back office computer of any kind, by design, has failed from the security model. And there may be extenuating circumstances, and maybe something you just simply have to live with because of the nature of the integration. But to me, as a general purpose computing device, the evidence that I have in terms of my experience with end users, how they abuse these systems, how we manage and secure them, how we treat them, they're almost impossible to get to the level of security we would love for them to be and to still be in the same space as our card data information. And so, unfortunately, one of the problems that we have is a lot of these systems have been built to work this way so that end users are forced to have this kind of connection. And one of the things that I think is really frustrating is we know how to solve this. We just haven't done it yet. And again, this is where other voices are important in this conversation. I certainly defer to them where there's good reasoning why this happens. But quite frankly, one of the things that I see that doesn't make a lot of sense to me and is really frustrating is when I see computers talking to other computers using human-computer interaction. For example, it makes all the sense in the world to me that if I'm an end user, that I would go to a point of sale and get an end-of-day report from it. I get that. And I even understand that I'm going to do that over something like a file share. I don't like the model, but I understand it because file shares are a natural way of users to talk to computers. But it's not an appropriate way from a computer to talk to a computer. Computers should be talking to computers with services and APIs. And ideally, the point of sale or other CDE systems should be pushing. They shouldn't be getting pulled from. And so ideally, the design that you want is a point of sale system that is always pushing to something else, like the back office machine. And I think we have the ability to do this. And I've seen configurations that support this, but I also know that the default is the opposite. And we continue to let back office machines talk to point of sale machines and other CDE systems. And I think as long as we continue to do this, we're going to continue to be plagued by security issues until we fix it. And so I think better design is deserved by everyone here. The last thing I want to talk about, and again, this is, this transition to talking about better design, is really around taint gauge monitoring. One of the things that I saw over and over again is how often we allow this full access to these edge systems with no consideration for the consequences. And I want to give you an example of that. This is a screenshot that I took a few days ago. You can see the timestamp up here in the upper left. And for those of you that are unfamiliar, what we're looking at is the inventory output from a taint gauge system. And I didn't go and get this on my own in terms of talking to a taint gauge. Rather, what I did was use a platform that some of you may be familiar with called Shodan. Shodan, for those that are not familiar, is basically like a Google-style search engine for IoT devices. It goes around, scans for various IoT systems, and then reports them. And what we're looking at is a system on a default port 10,001. You can see that in the top left. And what has happened is this scanner has run this command that you can see right above this timestamp, I20100, which is the code for dumping the inventory. This is one of thousands of systems like this on the internet, on the edge, completely unsecured. This white blank square that you see below the timestamp is where I've kind of marked out the information about where this store is. But if you go to Shodan and you type in that same information and you type in any kind of brand information that you want in our vertical, you'll find almost everyone represented. This is something that we first started to really hear a lot about back in 2015. Some researchers back at Trend Micro said, listen, we've got a serious problem with this kind of telemetry system on the edge. And, we wanted to do some investigation around it. So they actually wrote some software that in the style of a honeypot, which simulates a taint gauge system, and called GasPot. And they basically just watched as all of these malicious actors had created automation systems to basically roll around the internet trying to find these things and to manipulate them. So the question you may be asking is, okay, so what? What's the big deal? And the problem comes with how these things are generally used and integrated. In some cases, the harm can be rather small, but in other cases, it can be quite dramatic. Depending on what commands you run on these systems, you can impact fueling. You can lock people out by setting passwords and effectively treat it like ransomware. You can break the integration with point of sale systems. And you have all sorts of environmental issues around reporting here. And so with so many thousands of systems just left on the edge unprotected, we're just sitting here waiting for disaster. And I've been in the situation of helping to respond to incidents where people who have had systems left on the edge unsecured are all of a sudden trying to clean up a huge mess from people who have gone in and broken a lot of these configurations. So the question is, how do we end up here? Why do we have so many systems that are set up like this? And it largely comes down to how we build them out. And so I have a diagram here that largely shows kind of the three ways in which we set up taint gauges. Over on the right, we have an internet. Over on the left, we have a store. And then we have our firewall in the middle with three types of possible integrations. At the top is one of the things that I think is really kind of interesting and something I'm seeing more and more now, which is where we have some kind of IoT device or local polling system connected to the taint gauge, and it's pushing out to the cloud. Lots and lots of people these days are pushing a lot of this information to central aggregators and software companies that are managing these systems as a whole for people. And I like this model, one, because it removes lots of issues around that trust to untrust. It wraps these things in TLS encryption. It just does a lot of things that I really like, and it speaks machine to machine, which I really like as well. The one in the middle is the one that we've done for a long time. And this is sort of the classic way of securing this interaction, which is where we create private tunnels, whether through VPN connections or similar types of setups in SD-WAN. And people reach in through those secure connections and they poll these systems directly. sadly, though, it's this third option at the bottom that leads to what I was just demonstrating and talking about. And that's where we have systems that are on the edge through port forwards, where you go to the IP address of, or host name of the system on the edge, and we map them over to the local network to that device. And you can absolutely restrict those things. You can put in, source and destination IP, addresses, service, ports, and generally be thoughtful about, how you allow people to connect to these systems. The problem is, I don't see people doing that. Both as an operator and as someone in the managed services space, one of the things that's so amazing is how many times I would come across a configuration like this, reach out to a team to say, hey, why haven't we got this better locked down? And they would say something to the effect of, well, we've asked the owner operators to provide us what we should match against for securing it against, the source address, and they won't provide us any information. Or something worse, with so many third parties now trying to, provide these types of aggregated services for retailers, many of them are in a situation where they're in, some kind of hyperscaler cloud, AWS, Azure, Google, and many of those hyperscalers have bought up millions of IPs. And so you end up in this situation. I can't tell you the number of times I've had a vendor come to me and say, hey, we need you to whitelist all of Cloudflare. We need you to allow all of AWS. And, it's just ridiculous because here we are in a situation, putting in our allow list all of these like /8, /24, /20s, and, huge blocks of internet IP address spacing. And it effectively does away with the value of securing it to a remote host. And so, until this changes, until we stop doing this, this is going to continue to be a huge problem. Now, I can't really solve the issue for the owner-operator that simply doesn't accept the risk of it. I can preach it, I can talk about it, but fundamentally at the end of the day, there's not a lot I can do about that. But what I can do is encourage our industry and our service to not abuse that capability, because too oftentimes I've seen integrators with these types of third-party aggregation systems come and say, well, if you don't want to use our IoT device, or we don't want to go through the networking hassle of setting up a secure tunnel, let's just do the port forward and call it a day. And we have to stop doing this as an industry. And we don't just do this for 10-gauge, we do it for all sorts of things. We do it from DVRs and camera systems and other telemetry systems, and it's just really something that has to change. The attitude I had when I was at Mapco and an operator, and one that I really take now when I'm doing design for other people, is you should allow nothing inbound by default, ever. I mean, it's just something I would never allow. But unfortunately, we're in a situation where some people just see that as their only resort. And I think that's something that we have to change our thoughtfulness about, and move away from an attitude of, does it work, to, is it the right thing? And I think, as I've been mentioning now, I think we have to be designing for trust to untrust. And the other thing we have to be doing is demonstrating how this is dangerous. And this is something we still can do. Until you're affected by it, you're largely willing to accept the risk. It's just the problem is we're so bad at analyzing and properly understanding the impacts of risk that we don't know what we're really trading. And I used to have a good friend that had a really good way of helping me to communicate risk to people, which is he would go to someone and say, instead of trying to get them to understand what might happen, what you need to get them to understand is, let's assume it's happened, how much money would you pay for it to have not have happened? And what we generally find, if we switch the question around and ask someone that, they're oftentimes willing to pay far more after the fact to fix the issue than what it would have cost to simply have prevented it. And that's the kind of thinking that we have to start engaging people on if we're going to make this better. That's the end of my presentation, and I certainly appreciate you listening, and I'm certainly open to discussion and Q&A at this time. Thank you.
Rob, thank you so much. That was great information, 3 great stories. You're a great storyteller too, so we appreciate that. Just wanted to remind everybody that the question panel is in the go-to webinar section, and to please type in your questions and we'll be happy to answer them. And again, please no vendor-specific questions. But Rob, great information. And you touched on a lot of things that we experience also when we're going through our compliance and doing our due diligence. And I'm thinking back to, there's so many questions I have for you, but thinking back to the first scenario on pen testing and the value thereof is we see so much resistance by the third parties and literally refusing to allow us to pen test their systems. Now, conversely, we've had others that have said, wow, a free pen test, that is fantastic. We welcome that, and we'd love that because, you just saved us, some money here. And again, we want to make sure our stuff is tight, but like I said, we've run into so much resistance and people just not having the right attitude, and it's really, really hard. And even for those that don't even quote unquote think that they're in scope for PCI compliance, right? And then later, as you do the deeper dive and you start peeling back that onion, and you realize that, oh, geez, they could affect the security of the cardholder data environment, which does put them in PCI scope. And so there's also an education of trying to get the folks there. But I guess some of the things the challenges that we run into for those that are resistant is, number one, they want to see, they don't want to give us any credentials. And that is really annoying because I'm going to waste a ton of money. Well, I shouldn't say a ton of money, but I'm going to waste money and I'm going to waste time from this consultant, this third-party consultant that we would use, just gaining access. Like you said earlier, just give them the credentials, and then here's the email address, here's the cell phone number. If we've we're certainly not here to do any malicious intent. And so, I mean, how do you approach that or did you approach that with third parties to try and get them to be more amenable to conducting those pen tests?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that doesn't have, unfortunately, a sort of a silver bullet. There's no panacea to it, but I will say this is, I think, what the intention of the data security standard has around managing vendors. If there's one thing that, quite frankly, and I've never been super great about it to the degree that I wish that I were, because you have so many business pressures to just prioritize operation that, being the security guy or girl or whoever that's sitting there going, hold on now, let's ask some really important questions before we engage these. I think a lot of this has to start before you even, work with these people, where you say, listen, before you come on board, here's what you have to agree to. And that's where you get some leverage there is you simply build it into the contracts, you build it into the relationship. The problem comes, to your point, where sometimes you don't even have those relationships, and that's kind of where we found ourselves. And that's where you sometimes just have to put pressure on people to say, we're going to rip this out and do something different, or in some ways you just kind of get stuck. And that's where I think one of the things that I'm seeing change to kind of address that I really like, and I'm sure other people are seeing this too, is I think this is where insurance is starting to pick up and deal with this a little bit. I've seen more questions in the last couple of years when I've gone through cybersecurity and insurance renewals, where these types of things are becoming a part of this. And so you end up making it sort of a claims issue where you say, listen, if you don't engage us in this way, here's how insurance is going to treat this, or here's how we're going to engage you if we have any issue that falls out from this. And so you start having to use some of those levers to work with people. But I think that's where we as an industry have to start really pressuring people to say, you can't play in the space if you're not going to, be mindful of, all the people that are affected by this and the operators. We're just simply too, close-knit of a group to let bad actors get away with that. So I think that's where we have an opportunity to do peer pressure, use insurance, and then really contracts to kind of deal with that. And then after that, I think it's just simply trying to do the best we can to make a convincing argument and to go from there. But I wish there were better solutions, but those are the three things that I've had to do to really engage people to do the right thing. Great.
Thank you. We have had a few questions come in, so I'm going to dive into those.
Yeah, sure.
And does the size of the organization dictate the risk of being attacked?
Yes and no. I mean, there's several things. I mean, obviously, the bigger you are, depending on what you're doing, you may have just a broader, attack surface. So if you're doing the same thing over and over, and you're exposing those things on the edge, then yes, you're more affected. But if you're a small entity and you're not doing good security, as well in some other spaces or good security design, you may have a much bigger attack surface than someone much larger than you. So it has far more to do with the attack surface than it doesn't necessarily with the size of the company. And so one of the things that you're often thinking about in terms of security design is not the size of the company, it's the size of the attack surface. And again, you don't always know what your attack surface is until you validate it with a penetration test or some other third-party audit. And so one of the things that you can do even before you do a pen test is engage professionals to say, let's do a risk assessment. What's the risk that I have? And one of the things they're going to do is look at all the areas in which you have exposed attack surface. So the things that we think about in security is, what's the attack surface? What are the possible threats? Who are the threat actors? And what are my vulnerabilities in that attack surface relative to those threat actors? And so those are the things that matter, not so much, people or headcount.
Thanks too. So would you consider the same level of security design for 1 store versus 10 store versus 100 stores?
I think the design, yes. Now the operational tooling around it is different. So if I have 1 store, if I could design the perfect store experience, no inbound access, the CDs not being talked to by the back office, I'm not exposing the 10 gauge on the edge, that's absolutely what I would do. It's just a question of, once I start scaling that past 1 store to 10 to 100 to, many thousands, what are the tools that I use to manage that at scale? So it's really more, not so much about the design changing, but what are the tools that allow me to manage that design at scale that change? But the design should largely stay the same, which is, we're thinking in terms of what are the trusted systems at the core, and what are the untrusted systems, and what are those relationships, and how are those things talking to one another? But no, the design fundamentally doesn't change, just the tooling around it.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have is VPN still considered secure for inbound access to the store?
Yeah, it is. There's lots of really great technologies out there. It's not so much VPN as a whole. How you configure a VPN matters a lot, but we have really great secure VPN technologies that are out there. I trust VPNs as a whole. It's more of that relationship of how things are moving. One of the things that I just really don't like the idea of is taking some zone over here and some zone over on this side and then allowing traffic to cross into it. Sometimes that's unavoidable. It's just how we manage systems, and that's okay. But in some cases, if I can design for something to always push out and design for no entry whatsoever, that's really good. Now, one of the things I didn't talk about in this space, and it's something that's going to be a huge conversation over the next decade as technology gets more mature, and it's certainly over the next few years, and we've heard a lot of marketing buzz already around it, is the idea of zero trust. And zero trust is something that I think is going to make a huge change in a lot of this, because we move from these general trusted, untrusted models being as big as they currently are to effectively saying we don't trust anything. Every single interaction from machine to machine and from person to machine has to assert that at the time, from the place and the person that's doing that it's okay to do what they're doing. And so that's one area where technology and process is maturing, and so we don't have that spread out everywhere, but it's really the next big thing in this space around us. So no, I'm not necessarily against it, but there are other models that I think, depending on what you're doing, are better.
Thanks. So what is your suggestion for a DVR, video, so to speak, port forwarding? So as remote viewing and remote recording, port forwarding is required. So what is the best practice to limit those IP addresses?
Yeah, again, this is one where, generally VPNs are better than anything. I mean, if you have some access where you need to look at, DVR access, you shouldn't be doing that directly hitting the firewall. You should be establishing a secure tunnel to that space and then viewing it locally as though you were there over the VPN. I really don't recommend any kind of port forward situation. I mean, if you have to do that, then what you really need to do is say, okay, what are the source addresses that are allowed to touch this port forward as they're coming in? But to me, you're just setting yourself up for failure, because we don't always keep a good kind of tracking of what we allowed and what we didn't. And so if you're at home, if you're an owner operator that's trying to log in and see those, cameras, your home ISP is not guaranteeing that your IP stays the same. And so as it changes, you're having to keep up with that. And so, those are just the kinds of issues that frankly humans don't scale well. We don't keep up with those details. So I really can't recommend any kind of unsecured access coming inbound across that for whatever reason. I really think that is where, at least for now, you should be using things like VPNs. But until you can get there, just being mindful of where you're coming from and restricting it to only that address is really the best you can do at this point.
Okay, thanks. So one of our listeners today said that they're looking to conduct a vulnerability scan prior to their pen testing.
Yeah.
And their understanding is that the vulnerability shows where the holes are, and the pen test is, for once you feel your network is hardened to see if the hackers can get through. So would you agree with that process?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Of course, I would be thoughtful about what you're paying for and how you're doing it, because quite frankly, any good pen test is going to include a vulnerability scan. Now, if you want to do a vulnerability scan ahead of time, and that way you have a sense of where I might have some issues and you try and remediate those before you engage in your pen test, that's great. And I think that's perfectly a good way to engage that exercise. But if you're simply especially if you're not doing it yourself and you've been sold a service where, we'll do a scan and then we'll do a pen test, I would really consider, is that, same scan going to be included in the pen test? But no, in terms of any remediation efforts, that's absolutely the first step for getting started in identifying what do you need to shore up before you validate what you think is a secure and hardened environment. So yeah, I think it depends on the context.
Thanks. We had a comment here that an attack surface can also be modified by the size of an organization's cyber insurance policy. So as an example, a policy of $2 million would lead to a ransomware attack with a ransom demand equal to the policy value. And so that comes with a link that I just added to the chat room. So thank you, Mr. Shepard, for providing that information. So yeah, you talked a lot. I know we're a little bit over on time here, but you talked a lot about don't use systems essentially, or be wary of systems that are reaching in. And that seems to be a pretty hot topic right now within the Conexxus Data Security Committee. And so a lot of folks are starting to look at that. And I'm going to put in a little plug here for a future Conexxus white paper that the Data Security Committee is publishing. But it's resources and guidance for safely moving business data out of a secure environment. So look for that white paper here, and probably right after the first of the year. And the read that and the feedback we've gotten from the members of the Conexxus Data Security Committee is that it's spot on. And wanted to thank Chris Bucalo for leading that project for us. So more to come as we get that through the process. But and I think that wraps it up for us today. Thanks everybody for staying over a little bit. And Rob, thank you again for all this great information. And if you would just flip to the next slide. Again, the website for Conexxus to get the webinar replays is right there. If you have any comments, please feel free to email us. And thank you again for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in December for the EMB session. Thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.